Lucas, so you have at various points said, hey, measuring the success of Bitcoin as its price in fiat really is not the right thing to do. And I hear you loud and clear on that. Like it totally makes sense to me. It's like it's not just number go up. If you're going to have a viable alternative kind of a currency, then you have to think about like, well, what are the true measures of success? I ran across this post and I thought it spoke very well towards the kind of stuff that you've been mentioning and crowing about, which has resonated with some in the Bitcoin community. I thought it would be fun to start maybe addressing that particular idea and playing this clip. What do you think?
Definitely. Let's play the clip because I posted a response down in, but I don't remember the point. I do actually remember the point that I made, but there were several things that I really liked that he brought up. Who is this Andreas Antonopoulos, by the way? Is this who is he in the Bitcoin community? Somebody that did this just come across your radar, or do you follow this person?
I don't follow him. It just kind of randomly came across. So, it's a happy accident or serendipity or whatever that ends up being.
Absolutely. Well, I need to see if I can track down his name because I thought he was spot on with one small nuance. But yeah, play it, cue it up, and good morning, Rusty. Good morning, Grant. Hope y'all had a fantastic Fourth of July weekend. It was a lot of fun here. Had a great time.
All right, yeah, let's play it. So let me know if you can hear it right off. So if there's anything, guys, I think I figured out how to do this. So here we go.
I mean, we're sitting having this conversation, and less than 15 minutes ago, Bitcoin hit
Sounds
a
good.
new all-time high. And to me, that is not a measure of success. It's a measure of popularity. It's a measure of interest. But it's not really a measure of success for a decentralized currency system. Its relationship to the dollar is not a really interesting measure of success. Although for many people, that's become the only one. For me, I think the measure of success is whether it fulfills some of the things that I saw as its early promise. And of course, that's highly subjective, right? I'm projecting my own expectations and my own measures onto this system. I think that's one of the things that you get when you have a very open, decentralized system like Bitcoin, is that there isn't just one measure of success, right? Everybody projects their own expectations onto it. I would say if I go with what I said earlier, which is I think Bitcoin is for the other 6 billion, then the measure of success that I see is has its use in developing nations and nations that really need um, freedom of currency and freedom of financial access to financial instruments. Um, and freedom of commerce. So in those countries where political interference in currency has created decade long tragedies, putting millions of people into poverty, in those countries, is Bitcoin today available, robust, usable by the people who need it most? And I think it is. I think, in fact, it's gotten better and better and better at that. It's easier to exchange, it's easier to transact, it's easier to use the wallets, it's more available in more places, and most efforts to restrict people from using it have failed, with very few exceptions. So from that perspective, I think it's fulfilling its promises. So I would say the KPI for me of Bitcoin success is, can an average person who is not particularly technical use this to achieve a degree of financial freedom in a country where the currency is broken, fundamentally broken. And on that metric, I think Bitcoin continues to succeed.
Okay, lots of good stuff there. Um, I think him
So
point. Go ahead.
him and you agreeing, saying number go up, and the fact that we have a high price is not what we need to be looking at. So him kind of just like me summarizing, is it being used in countries where the currency is fundamentally failing or has failed? and is it easy to transact to replace that currency to do commerce, right? That to me were the key takeaways. What did you get out of it?
Absolutely. I think he really nails that, it giving us it Bitcoin giving us advantage in which we begin to understand the inflationary supply of money is wonderful. Giving, he says developing countries, and he talks a little bit about giving them freedom of commerce. That's what really gave me pause. But it does give developing countries a ability um, to reset their currency on something besides gold and silver, these sort of traditional things that give people a notion of stability, and that they can secure it in ways that don't require armies or some sort of physical notion of security, I think is very important. But then I think that that's where he maybe is embracing a concept of um, of abundance that may not prove to be feasible in those countries, or is even in the United States been partially a lie.
Well, here's something that I saw as well, as far as is Africa adopting Bitcoin. There's a lot of talk about the current demographics of Africa being one of the only places where there's positive population growth. I thought that this was super interesting to take a look at. Sometimes when you see charts like this, it can be a little disingenuous because whatever, there's maybe 50 to 100 things on here, but Africa is a massive place. The Mercator projection of the maps make Africa look like it's the same size as a lot of places, and it is massively bigger than many places on this planet. But just seeing something like this and then knowing that Africa has its own day, right, which happened pretty recently. I don't know if you knew this, but to add a little fuel to this fire, just recently was Africa Bitcoin Day. So I think he's talking about this, developing places, like places that we wouldn't canonically think of first world, right? That Bitcoin is enabling things in those places that, arguably weren't really working that well because of rampant corruption or because the currency is just, massively inflated or somehow manipulated in a way that forces people out of it or makes it really hard to use it as a relatively stable currency.
Yeah, I love that you say a Mercator, because in for many years I called the Bitcoin a globe as opposed to the Mercator projection of the dollar. And I said that because when you stretch the dollar or our financial system of currencies in some ways, like it's not ubiquitous, like stretching out the amount of it, you also pick winners and losers in where you stretch a currency. So I always thought it interesting that the globe gave us an ability to think about transactions and monetary systems in a truer, realer way. Uh,
I got to nerd out just a little bit. I've always really been impressed by the work of Buckminster Fuller, and this was one of the first things that ever caught my eye about how to make a better map. And it's the Dymaxion map, and this allows for a non-distorted view of landmass because you don't try to project the globe onto a cylinder. Instead, you project it onto an icosahedron, and then you can lay it flat. It looks a little weird because essentially everything is on a triangle, but it allows you to see the relative size of Africa. It's like Africa is almost as big as all of Europe and Russia could together. And it's definitely bigger than the United States, which on a Mercator projection you do not see that. So I really appreciate when there are certain types of visualizations that allow us to understand the world a bit better. And so this idea that there's distortions of how we think about things because of the standard way that information or technology is presented to us can really color our thinking a lot. And I think just the size of Africa is one of them. But like what you're saying about Bitcoin, it really resonates. But I had to bring this up because, if we're talking about a Mercator projection, maybe we're losing a lot of people, but it's the way that you standardly show the globe and its distortion of reality. So, I'll just bring that up quick so that everybody can know what we're talking about. And I think everybody is very used to seeing this, but they don't know how distorted this really makes the world seem.
Yeah, look at Antarctica. You would think, and I love Buckminster Fuller also. I'm so glad you brought up the Dymaxion projection. In my house, one of the things I'm a thrift store shopper. I always pick up globes whenever, and I hang them at different. I hang them upside down. I hang them sideways. I hang them quote unquote right side up, because it also helps you to remember that not everybody sees the world in the same way. But
Yeah, and I think that's what we're talking about here is how are we seeing the world, right? And how do we measure the success of Bitcoin? So if you start to look at stuff like this and you say, where is Bitcoin starting to be adopted? We've talked a lot about Central and South America. We're talking about El Salvador. We got to talk more about El Salvador today because there's some interesting things going on there. So there are places like Costa Rica and El Salvador that are adopting this as a currency. We've got a lot of companies that are adopting Bitcoin as a treasury mechanism. We have whole ecosystems that are starting to latch onto this as a means of exchange and payment system. And so I think it's this kind of stuff that we have to look to, not just number go up. I think number go up is going to be a byproduct of mass adoption of Bitcoin, and just the fact that it is a limited currency. It is constrained. It's done as a point of its conception to be that way. So, it's non-inflationary, and that means that as the world starts to adopt Bitcoin for various reasons, whether it's a L2 exchange for buying coffee in El Salvador and Costa Rica, or whether it's a reserve asset used by ETFs and major corporations as a way to manage treasury. And I've even seen things where startup companies and companies that are being managed by VCs have said holding some amount of Bitcoin, enough to at least make one or two payrolls, is absolutely appropriate. Because if you ever end up in a situation like what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, where you quickly need access to cash because of some insolvency where you normally hold the money that is the treasury for your company, Bitcoin is the alternative financial rails. And so, as it's starting out being an alternative and becoming primary, that's where things start to turn around and get pretty interesting. But yeah, I think that this is right on point, and I'm glad we had a chance to play that clip because it really resonated with a lot of things you've been saying.
Well, you've said, and Andreas said, and used some words that I want to maybe get into a little bit of history for. Developing and first world, second world, third world. Do you know where that verbiage or that lexicon comes from?
I believe it's colonial. It's British, right? It's British imperialism.
Well, this notion of first world, second world, third world, or using this term of developing, actually goes to the IMF and the World Bank, and those countries that are fully incorporated into the IMF and the World Bank are first world countries. Those that are trying to join are second world countries, and those who are not interested are third world countries. And I mentioned last week that the getting into where the IMF and the World Bank. Maybe I'll briefly go through in 1944 after
Well,
World.
I don't have a positive view of IMF and the World Bank personally. I mean, aren't these the guys that try to saddle countries with exorbitant loans and essentially make countries like debt slaves as a whole? Isn't that what the IMF and the Monetary Fund do?
Absolutely, going so after the First World War, there was a problem in that the countries that won in Europe asked Germany to pay back in gold, and yet Germany had no gold. And in fact, the United States had amassed great large reserves of most of the world's gold, and France and Great Britain had a little bit more. So they had another fight over over the lack of the payment of that debt and the debt slavery that France and Great Britain had forced upon Germany, and the political fallout for that.
I think
And
I've got the right thing, right? That was called reparations, World War II reparations.
well, I mean, World War One reparations. Like if you go to World War One reparations, you can see sort of the demands that. But make it a new tab, and because we're going to get to World War II reparations. So long story short, we have demanding gold from a country who doesn't have access to it when you already have all the gold. What do you do? Because the country was not going to give up its sovereignty, and so led to World War II. Coming out of World War II, the United States called together a conference, the Bretton Woods Conference, because they said, we had a fight over gold coming out of the last World War. We should get out of this. We should get out of this loop, and in doing so, why don't we make an international currency? And we'll put that international currency into a we'll put it into a some sort of democratic organization that decides on how much money we have, because we've made all these things, we're growing all of these we're making products, we're growing like more crops than we have before, we're shipping them around the world. We don't need to be hamstrung by a lack of currency, or you know uh, a lot of that currency being amassed by one nation at a time. And so they called together the Bretton Woods Conference, and they came together. This was from Maynard Keynes, and a man named Harry Dexter White was an American who was the whiz kid for Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury under FDR. And Harry Dexter White tweaked Maynard Keynes's concept of this international currency, and they copied the setup of the Federal Reserve and the United States Treasury into two institutions where countries could invest money into the World Bank, or place it in the liquidity pool. Let's use some blockchain terminology. Put it in the liquidity pool of the World Bank, and then the IMF would draw from the World Bank and give out loans to various countries. And that was all supposed to be done on an international currency that was created to be held by this newly created World Bank, that was going to be called the Bancor, Bancor. And the United States, holding not only a large portion of the world's gold at that time, but also holding the debt of many of the Western European countries, because leading into World War II, we had created the Lend-Lease Act, and because those countries could not afford to pay us for arms, FDR had a very famous fireside chat where he got on the radio and he said, when your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't sell your neighbor a garden hose, you lend him one. And then you settle out after the fire is put out. And because there were no terms placed on the munitions and the things, the food, etc., that the United States had been sending to Europe, coming out of World War II, we said, well, here's the price tag. And it certainly wasn't cheap. And so long story short, we kind of twisted the arms of France and Great Britain to get rid of this notion of the Bancor and supplant that with the United States dollar. And so the dollar became the great denominator for all of the world's currencies. And it is through the World Bank and the IMF that we now distribute dollars throughout the world. And exactly to what you said about sort of the predatory nature of the terms of the loans from the IMF, it is through those that we demand austerity and can make very extractive terms to take the great amount of wealth from most of the countries of the world. And so that's also where we get this notion of first world, second world, third world, because France, notably, most of all, was very, very dubious of the notion that the United States was only going to print so many dollars according to their gold holdings and was not going to abuse their position as the creator of the international currency. And they were 100% right, because we immediately began to inflate the amount of dollars that we were sending throughout the world. And we sent a lot of those like instantly through the Marshall Plan, in rebuilding the world. But the thing the United States knew at that time, and has seemingly forgotten, was that you can create money and give it to people as long as it's for creating things. It's a whole different thing whenever you try to demand money back. Like this notion of sanctions that we have today are part of the reason that the United States is becoming, or the dollar is becoming odious to so many other countries. And the other part of that is Bitcoin and using a computer network also gave individuals in these countries the ability to begin to see and understand what having an alternative might look like. And so
a truly international currency, one that isn't controlled by anybody, one that can't be easily inflated. I think that these are all the things that, are starting to look like, okay, maybe we're not particularly in control of this currency, but since nobody is, that's actually better. That we actually have an international currency now, which isn't in the hands of any particular user, is truly decentralized, and isn't subject to these arbitrary inflationary whims of particular individuals. Now, we might still have quite a bit of an issue here with respect to what happens when you're on a standard like this and very elite particular institutions have all of the Bitcoin. Then we're back to the cross of gold stuff that we talked about last week, right? Where this can be very problematic if we have all the Bitcoin in the hands of JP Morgan and BlackRock and whoever else.
Well, and that's part of my worries about the Bitcoin, but also I don't know, I think what we will see are more countries that begin to put Bitcoin into a vault, a bank, give a seed, put it in a wallet, give the seed phrase to a group of people who are part of their political establishment, and create their own currency on top of that. Seeing this notion of ETFs, which look a lot like stable coins, it seems to me like what we're going to see more countries doing. They're going to consider the Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, some other cryptocurrencies, as specie in which they put into some sort of institution, and then they develop their own currency. And this is where CBDCs come, and we, some notion of CBDCs is the control and whatnot, but there's also this notion that, like, on one cryptocurrency you can mirror and place another cryptocurrency that gives you some flexibility, because as we saw with the use of the dollar, having a monetary system that is in some small part inflationary it greases the political wheels, because you're not immediately like trying to figure out who the loser is. And I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but this notion of like pegging to 2% inflation, that comes to us from Australia, and from narratives about like we make more things than the world. Going back to this notion of you put wheat in the ground, you put put a boy sheep and a girl sheep together in a fin, like there's naturally more whenever the correct things happen in the world. And so some of the notion of currency is that should be reflected in the monetary system. I don't know about that. I say that capitalism is the notion of letting things fail. And so because I wonder as to the wisdom behind creating a monetary system in which you're hiding or moving the loser into the future. Um, but and that's where Andreas also mentioned the freedom of commerce. Not only that, but I there was Bukele last, I believe, maybe Friday or maybe it was on Saturday, had a conference with his cabinet.
Well, wait, before we get to that, like, because I thought we were going to go in order here. So let's get to Bukele in a second. So I think we can quickly cover this one because there was some misinformation that happened out there amongst the world discussing what Germany was doing. I saw posts like this, and I think you even mentioned it to me. I was like, oh, look at this. Germany is buying back the Bitcoin. And there were some other people who said, no, 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 hold on. Germany is not buying back any of its Bitcoin. This was just like some retransfer back that didn't sell out of some exchange. They're moving it to other places and they're still dumping Bitcoin. That's what is still happening here. So, what we said last week where Justin Sun said, hey, let me buy the whole bag. They apparently did not take him up on that offer and they are still selling off Bitcoin. That was complete misinformation that Germany was ceasing their sales. So this is not correct. Germany is still actively dumping BTC. So I think that one's continuous coverage of the situation here. So as we brought up all the nations and how much Bitcoin there was, Germany at one point had 50,000 BTC. They have been actively dumping it as fast as they can. Who knows why they're really doing it? We see that there's dissent amongst their parliament as to whether this is a good idea. A lot of people are saying this is going to be, catastrophically a bad move by Germany. But yeah, so just a little coverage there. But yeah, let's talk about El Salvador unless you have any other comments on the Germany situation.
Well, just that again, let's remind people that Germany is second in the world with regards to gold reserves. So what do they have? As long as gold is also a stable asset in which to mirror and create your currency off of, provide some notion of stability, then what need do they have of Bitcoin? And
Well, that's an interesting point. It really comes down to what are they doing with those proceeds. So if they're taking the Bitcoin proceeds and they're turning around and buying gold with it, that would be pretty interesting. So I'll have to do some sleuthing to see if I see Germany buying gold or whatever. Because if that's the move here, because it sounds like that's what you're speculating on is like they said, hey, we don't need this Bitcoin because we're actually going to flop this Bitcoin to gold. Then they're just like dumping this on the market so that they can go pick up gold as fast as they can. And I know that gold buying has been on kind of a tear. We don't usually cover the price of gold on this show, but gold is sitting at, I don't know, 10 or 15 or maybe even all-time highs here. It's been kind of a wild run up. So there have been a lot of countries that have been actively buying the crap out of gold.
I would bet that they are buying gold. I bet they're also selling United States Treasury bonds and using the profit that they're making from Bitcoin to cover the losses that they're making there, if any. Those would be my guesses. Um, the
Okay, well, I'm gonna take 2 seconds to sleuth that out, see if I can just do a quick Google search, see if Germany's buying gold.
And I also think it's very important that we make a distinction between investing in a gold ETF, which is some sort of notion of a private currency. These
No, no,
ETFs.
no. Hold on. What I was talking about was not about buying ETFs. Countries are taking physical delivery of gold, and I know that there was even some talk of the gold that China was buying, and they investigated it. Like they started drilling into the gold, and they got a bunch of scam gold. So there's been some fraudulent stuff that's been happening out there with respect to gold, and that's a strong distinction between gold and Bitcoin. Bitcoin cannot be faked. Gold can be faked. There's a way to do it. There are certain metals which have very similar weights to gold. I think it's tungsten that I've seen that allows you to, sort of make something that, unless you're very, very careful about your scales and weights and the way that you look at it, it can be adulterated. So that's one thing about Bitcoin is it's very hard to adulterate Bitcoin. The network just immediately rejects it. So that I guess that's one thing that we don't bring up enough is when we compare gold to Bitcoin, gold has this other property that you've got to do a bunch more extra work to ensure that what you're getting is actually gold and not something else.
100%. And the phrase "taking physical delivery" is at 100% correct. We like uh, constituents of sovereign nations should pay attention, and whenever their leaders say that we're buying gold, they should ask more questions until they discern that the country is actually taking physical delivery of that gold. Because the United States, uh, uh, as we created more dollars in order to keep people in, keep not people, other countries in on that loop, we started selling off of our gold. But we said, but we're going to hold on to that for you. We're going to provide the security and protect that for you. So when you go to the gold vault at the New York City Federal Reserve Bank, I believe 2/3 or more of that are owned by the various sovereign nations of the world, and the United States is providing a service to them by keeping that in New York City and holding on to their actual gold for them. And um, even more even more jaw dropping, of the 400,000 bars of gold in the Bank of London, um, the Bank of London only owns two of those bars of gold. So they can talk about their bars of gold. The other 398,000, 398, whatever, 399,998 are owned by private individuals and corporations and other sovereign nations. And the Bank of London is again holding them there. Why would other countries do that? Well, because the United States gives them access to the dollar and the international trade system, and also London. This is why we have such a special friendship with London, with Great Britain, and part of the deal that we made with them to get them to sign on to the dollar denominated international monetary system back in
I can't find any easy evidence of Germany buying gold. So if it's happening, we're gonna have to either get to one of our listeners to hit us up with a link, but I can't find it. And let me know if you end up in your travels seeing it. But no immediate first searching. It looks like I found some things dating back 4 or 5 years ago about Germany selling gold and drawing down their gold reserves. That didn't seem to track with some of the other stuff that we had looked at more recently about the current reporting of gold holdings. So it'd be interesting if they were doing it. I think that there's no evidence at this point that they see, so could be happening, but maybe I just didn't find it. So we'll have to do a little bit more digging or find something else that dispels that notion.
And maybe it's also a good time to mention that part of the brilliance of the creation of the national banking system in the United States back in 1862 was that it privileged the type of payments that were made to financial institutions. So other banks that joined into that to that national banking system were paid in gold, and private corporations and private individuals were paid in the currency unit, in the paper dollar. And so that is part of the problem of that system that we've seen today. And I've mentioned Teddy Roosevelt and the progressive era of Republicans that's tried to tackle the trusts and the corporations, but they never actually went right back to the financial to the banking system and created parity for who was being paid in gold and who was being paid in paper money, so that the financial institutions were put on the same footing. But let's go to what's happening in El Salvador, because President Bukele is taking a lot of flack for his speech there, in which he had a meeting and they talked about the price of food, and he admonished the business class, or the grocery stores and the food distributors in El Salvador to lower their food prices and to conform to,
Or else, right? I think that was
or else.
yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, I, like, we have this narrative of private corporations, and the public sector and the private sector, but to me that has been abused, and I don't know that there's any distinction between the two, apart from private being where people are allowed to fail and public being where they are not allowed to fail. And I don't know. I think that unless El Salvador creates a currency that they control, that is based off of their holdings of Bitcoin, in some way, a stable coin, algorithmic, or what have you, we're going to see more of this, because it's absolutely in their interest to control the prices. They have to respond, especially as a democratic institution, to the voice of the people, or to a larger group of people. And the United States and other countries in where they have had the ability to print more money have done so by selecting winners or incentivizing people, rather, or companies, rather than just giving them a rule and saying you can't do something. And so I think
Well,
that
and in America, I think some of the ways that this is hidden is we do direct cash payments through food assistance, right? So we have SNAP and various different programs that, fall under the banner of welfare. The other thing that we do is we subsidize certain types of foodstuffs to make food cheaper. So we have direct payments to farmers in some sense that allow us to lower the price of food, and all of that really is deficit spending. Like we don't actually have the money to pay for that kind of stuff. So this is all happening on the backs of anybody who's been holding US dollars and losing buying power through inflation. That's how US has been hiding it. So, El Salvador, if ostensibly does not have the ability to hide it in that way. So, they can say this, but who's really going to shoulder those costs? How's that going to work?
absolutely, and in part, what the United States has done is also to rob other countries through the IMF, and talk about rules based order, and doing the best for everybody. Now, in our private chat, I put a link to a USDA government publication, and it talks about the history of price support and adjustment programs starting in 1933, which is whenever we begin to create crop insurance. Because go back to rewind back to FDR and the quote unquote Great Depression, in which, Milton Friedman, and Annie Schwartz, I think, have this notion that there was a lack of money. The way that they saw it then was there was too much of an abundance of grain, and too many eggs, too many cattle, too many sheep. And so
Right, and this was this craziness we've been talking about several times, alluding to about how they were burning the crops and burying stuff and getting rid of it because like they wanted to keep the price high and not allow for the superabundance.
absolutely. And that, it was here that the a an advisor to FDR, and I think his name was George Warren. George Warren came up with this notion of, well, you could start manipulating the price of gold, and encouraging financial transactions that were betting on whether the price of gold is going up and down. So you could get dollars moving around by manipulating the price of gold, and meanwhile start using things like insurance and crop subsidies to incentivize farmers to plant corn, to plant wheat, or to not plant anything at all, because they weren't getting insurance for tracts of land that you deemed undesirable, or You know, if you're not playing along with the chicken growing guidelines or the beef growing guidelines, etc. And this also is what gets really interesting with this notion of the Chevron doctrine and the Supreme Court's denial of the rules that get made under the agencies that were created under the executive of the United States. Because where were those created? Those were New Deal agencies that were created under this new notion of creating money to incentivize and change behavior. So I think that it's in some ways a better system, but again, who bears? We've seen too much political interference rather than letting those people who make bad bets or grow the wrong crop or grow too many sheep. We don't let them fail, and we always have this notion of price go up, price go up, price go up. Well, that has piggybacked on the notion of we've just been creating more and more dollars, more and more dollars, more and more dollars, more and more insurance, and rather than letting prices reset. I also brought up Omar Mauve. Did you happen to get a chance to look at his thesis that our narrative of economy has risen from the notion of crop storage?
Well, wait a minute. Before we get to that, just what you were talking about, I wanted to ask a question. Does this have anything to do with CRP?
Absolutely, Conservational Reserve Program. CRP
Okay.
was
What do you know about that? Tell us a little bit about CRP, because this is something that has been on my radar, but I know the basics of this is just like saying, hey, take the land out of production, and then what, you get paid to keep it fallow and let it go back to nature? Is that what it means?
that's pretty much it. So if you are paying for crops to be grown on land, the way to make sure that everyone buys into that is to also pay for crops that are not to be grown on land. And so if you enter into the CRE,
Now that seems like some 1984 doublespeak to me. It's like,
I mean, well, let's go back to the World Bank then, because I mentioned, part of the problem of the IMF and the World Bank being denominated in dollars instead of Bancors has been, how do they get off of dollars? And then to bring up, what are carbon credits?
Is it the IMF switches to Bitcoin, or no? You're saying the IMF is going to switch to carbon credits?
The IMF and the World Bank are looking to switching to special voting rights, SVRs, because you can think of it like right now, the voting power of the participating members in the World Bank are determined by how many dollars that they've invested, added to that liquidity pool. And so if you're trying to get off of dollars or what's actually put in the pool, you can think about like looking at it as a percentage of buy-in. And this is where the notion of carbon credits begins to take hold. People like countries that start taking as pieces of land production or other production out of I don't know, putting that into the carbon markets is going to be part of the basket of specie that SVRs are going to be based off of. And that's not something that is easy to look up. But when I talk to people who work for the World Bank, and I've had a chance to a couple of times, and other economists.
I must be looking something up wrong, because I was trying to get this on the screen. So SBR,
SV, special voting rights, and they come and go under various names, but you can basically think of it in terms of what is the percentage of dollars that have been that have been invested in the World Bank by various nations, and that is they are assigned voting rights for the percentage that they have invested, special voting rights. I'm trying to think of.
I still can't find anything. But anyway, let's go back to CRP for a second. So this relates to the World Bank as far as it's double speak. We're paying to put land out of production, crop insurance on land that is in production.
Well, I don't know that it's necessarily double speak either, because the way that it would be understood to be double speak is if there is an endless amount of resources in the world. And I don't know that that's true. There's that also, going back to Omar Move, I think it's very important that we begin to.
Okay, let me get Omar Move on the screen since we're going to talk about that. So give me a second to pull that up.
Okay, well, and briefly, while you're pulling it up, Omar Move had a economics paper book. I don't remember which recently, an idea that I find very compelling, that talks about this narrative that we have in the world about food scarcity, about providing food throughout the world, is based on selecting certain crops. And you you can think about Klaus Schwab talking about eating the crickets, which
I don't want to eat any crickets, man.
You've never eaten a cricket. How do you know? You might actually love it.
I've seen some things that say what's it called? The carapace, like, is not something that we can easily digest, and it leads to inflammation, whatever. I don't know. I don't think that this has been a food that's traditionally been eaten by humans. I know that insects can be eaten. I know that crickets and grasshoppers are probably the two most palatable ones, right? If I recall from what I've seen.
Well, I'm probably not going to be eating any crickets either. But and that's just that seems to me to be a an abstraction from the idea. I guess if you think about yams, you think about other things that are not staples. Omar Move says especially in if I remember correctly, this paper had a lot to do with Native American agricultural history, because we can see a massive a massive shift to city states and culture in the areas that start to grow corn, and yet they had all sorts of tubers, things that are in the ground. The potato is from the Americas, yams may be from Africa, but the sweet potato is from the Americas. I forget which. But even think to, like, our notion of Africa being quote unquote behind. Part of that understanding goes to do they have a developed nation state? Do they have grain storage? Are they on wheat? Wheat comes us to, we talk about civilization, and so much of that Western narrative of civilization goes back to Mesopotamia, and what was important about Mesopotamia? Well, wheat. That's where wheat was modified to be ideal for human consumption and storage.
Yeah, and famously in some of the oldest writings talking about bread and beer as being those things which define civilization.
Amen. But then also think back to, because we don't have to eat crickets, like you think about all the things that are edible in our natural world around us that we absolutely ignore. And also, not only that, but how, like in the United States, we grow corn everywhere. I'm here in the panhandle of.
Speaking of which, I think, when we talk about corn, we at least have to pay lip service to something that is getting a lot of traction because of, Kennedy running for president, is glyphosate and Roundup. Like this here, if you haven't looked into it, really got to put this word in your lexicon, look it up. You definitely need to look into what's going on with glyphosate. If you're not already hip to what this is, it's also known as Roundup. And, since we grow a lot of corn in the United States, this is getting dumped everywhere on all the land, all over the place, because Roundup Ready corn is like the most common type of corn grown in the U.S. And I believe it's starting to be rejected at the borders of many countries, because I think it's the EU and several other places are saying we're not going to take any corn that could be contaminated with glyphosate.
Well, and yeah, Roundup Ready corn is everywhere. Corn also has, again, I'm in a water poor area on the Ogallala Reservoir, or the Ogallala Aquifer, and most of it has been depleted and is absolutely empty. And why would farmers here continue to grow corn? Because the government pays them a lot more in crop insurance to grow corn. And whether that corn makes or not, all they have to do is go to the ASCS office afterwards, to the United States Department of Agriculture, and say, I played by the rules. Here were the rules that you laid out. I grew this many acres of corn. It didn't make anything. Give me my subsidy check.
Yep. There is one of the other of these like wild things that happen when you have the fiat currencies and whatever, is you get these market distortions. And this is another one. You're growing corn in a place that ostensibly would never have supported, doesn't make any economic sense to grow corn there. But because we have fiat currency that's being debased, and you have crop insurance from the United States government, you can grow the most asinine, stupid crop in the world that doesn't make sense to grow in the desert, and you get a big fat check because you got crop insurance and growing something that makes no economic viability sense to grow it where it's being grown.
And I love corn. Like, not to go all the omnivore's dilemma on everyone. Corn is closely associated to the native. That's Michael Pollan, if you want to pull it up. He says,
Oh yeah, love that book. But I mean, but the corn that's being grown, that's not human edible corn. I mean, if you were to go out and take a big ear of corn, of Roundup Ready corn, that's not the sweet corn that we know and love from the 4th of July celebrations or whatever. This is field corn. This is vastly different product. Like, this is used to make ethanol and like all kinds of crazy stuff.
all sorts of crazy stuff that we have to come up with, because to me, the notion of crop insurance is not the problem. It's the lack of nuance in that.
You know what I used to hear a lot about, and I almost never hear about anymore? The Farm Bill. Remember when they used to talk about the Farm Bill? Whatever happened to the farm bills? Like, that never gets discussed anymore.
Well, that's because large corporations own all of the farms and the land in America, and they don't want to have that conversation. They don't need John Mellencamp singing "Little Pink Houses." They want to have that conversation with their lobbyists, and they want to. I would say many of them have an eye on carbon credit schemes, but also just. And I don't mean to make devils or enemies out of any of them, but they don't want that to be a public conversation, because and when it is, like, look at the screaming of the small farmers in Idaho, and how that was totally avoided.
We're talking about what we talked about with water and the Idaho farmers and the cobalt mining.
Yeah, and go back. Yeah, so it was Idaho farmers against cobalt mines in the state. When in reality, there's one tiny cobalt mine that doesn't take that much water, and the majority of the water that they were taking was from other farmers down the river. And but no, like, if you're going to plead to a lot of people who aren't farmers, you're not going to say, well, I'm stealing from another farmer. You're going to say, well, I'm stealing from a corporation, or the state ain't doing right by me. But to go back to corn, corn, most of our corn does go to animals, and like, also backs up our animal production, and we see health problems.
We feed it to cattle, grain finishing and just grain fed cattle, and then But I think also we go to domestic sugar production, right? And fructose corn syrup and whatever.
Absolutely. All sorts of problems like that. And meanwhile, we used to grow sugar beets all over the United States. We don't grow sugar beets anymore. Why? Because the sugar lobby from Hawaii, and I mean, one of the oldest, some of the oldest political interference into growing what the market called for goes back to getting us dependent on sugar from Hawaii, and that was, I mean, two senators representing an entire state and flexing their muscle in the Senate said that we need to ensure that Colorado and Kansas and Nebraska are growing corn or something else besides sugar, anything but sugar. And we see that, we see that with California almonds. We see that with corn in the plains. Um, and we've lost a lot of nuance in specialty crops, and not because crop insurance doesn't work and isn't a better system, but because we're putting it all in the hands of the same people, the USDA and and four different agricultural behemoths: Archer Daniels Midland, Cargill, JBS, and one other I can't think of. Because we have
Really,
seen.
that definitely makes me think of something that now that we're talking about this and the wide diversity that we sometimes talk about on this show makes me think about that there has been a pushback against this corporatization of farms. Like small independent organic farmers still exist. There's definitely been movement in this direction that I've seen gain quite a bit of traction, at least in some parts of the United States. I know the Pacific Northwest has a pretty strong movement in this direction. Minnesota and Wisconsin actually have quite a bit of this as well, where there are local food cooperatives, there are independent organic farmers that directly sell to individuals. And even uh, one of the individuals that we had as a guest, Nathan Hansen, when he came on, in his defense of raw milk and raw milk production, there is quite a bit of pushback against this large scale corporate farming stuff that's going on. And largely what has to happen for that to be enabled and for it to work is you have to eliminate the middleman, right? When you can truly price things according to what the consumer is willing to pay, then farmers can make it. Farmers can actually survive. But it's not possible if you have these, very extractive individual organizations that take the lion's share of the profits and, leave the small family farmer with nothing. So I definitely hear what you're saying, and I think that there is some, good news in the direction towards, could this ever be reversed? And I think Kennedy's talking a lot about, can we do anything about this? And seems like he's got some ideas, but I'll tell you what, I haven't heard one peep out of Biden about that. And that used to be, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Whatever happened to the farmer part of farmer labor?
100%. And part of the problem with the Republican and the Democratic parties is that they have become addicted to robbing other countries of the world through the IMF and the World Bank, because there is a longer feedback loop to get back to them for that. I put a link over in the right to Capper-Volstead, and you mentioned cooperatives. This is where blockchain enthusiasts should be laser focused right now, and thinking about raw milk, and thinking about agricultural regions, or specific regions, watersheds, and what crop profile best fits that watershed. And then they should be thinking about organizing cooperatives under the Capper-Volstead Act and putting that on a specific blockchain. Because whenever they begin to create a blockchain middleman, a crypto middleman that backs a cooperative, then we will finally have tools that keep us from having these cooperative be captured by the marketing company, processing company that sits at the end or the head of the farmers. Capper-Volstead also goes back to antitrust era, but anyway.
Well, we're at the hour.
We are. I'm glad we got to Capper-Volstead and we got to some sort of interesting nuances about where money comes from. And Omar Mauve, also very interesting thoughts with regards to getting us out of this notion of shortages of feeding. You know, like we talk about a world that lives on some sort of perpetual notion of fear, and we all and gives us a political trap of trying to think of the phrase that everybody talks about, food security. We need to stop thinking in terms of food security, and we need to be thinking in terms of dependence of different food chains, because we have a lot of options and we ignore many of them. Anyway, great conversation today. I don't know if you have anything more, Grant, but I enjoyed it. It was fun.
Always a pleasure. We'll see you guys tomorrow.